mute themselves and show their video. I really want to say thank you to everyone for being patient. We had some glitches with the link. So again, if you didn't get to see the end of the film, we'll make sure we can have the link valid through tomorrow so you can finish watching it. I hope you enjoyed the film, and we are going to be taking questions from the audience after Sarah asks her questions. So again, make sure you put your questions in the Q&A. If you put them in the chat, we won't see them. So if you want to ask a question, and there's a little button there, thumbs up. If you click that, that upvotes the question. So if many people are interested in the same question, it'll bring it to the top so we can ask that question. We'd also love for you to take a short survey at the end of this, or I will email it to you as well. And this helps us understand what you think about the film and how we can improve our future events, as well as it gives us the opportunity to share with you the commitments to take action that I mentioned earlier. The survey link will be at in the chat at the end, but again, I will email it to you. And we have an incentive for people to complete the survey. So anyone who answers the survey will be entered into our prize drawing for a chance to win some prizes. 2 lucky winners will receive Paul Hawken's book, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And a lot of the things in the book were discussed in the film. And we know we have people from outside of LA. So for those of you in LA, 2 LA participants, 2 lucky winners will receive $20 worth of farmers market dollars. And you can use that at our Santa Monica Farmers Market to get some great produce. So let's get the panel started. I'm so pleased to introduce our moderator, Sarah Spitz. For 28 years, Sarah Spitz was a producer and publicity director for KCRW Public Radio, as well as a freelance arts producer for NPR. In 2020, she wrapped up an 8-year stint writing a weekly arts and culture column for Santa Monica Daily Press. In 2006, she became a University of California Master Gardener for Los Angeles County and was certified in 2011 as a UC Master Food Preserver. She is currently a member of the Kitchen Cabinet Advisory Board for Food Forward, a nonprofit organization that prevents food waste by rescuing surplus produce to feed those in need in 8 Southern California counties. In the past 11 years, more than 125 million pounds of food have been recovered and shared with more than 2 million recipients through a network of 1,800 partner agencies. Sarah is also a volunteer for a startup nonprofit called Breadhead in Venice, which provides produce and pantry items to people who receive government benefits and educates those recipients about nutrition and cooking. Great job, Sarah, and welcome.
Thank you. And before we get started, Gina, thank you. Thank you, Brenda, who's behind the scenes, Santa Monica's Office of Sustainability and the Environment, and Sustainable Works for inviting me to be with you tonight. Really honored to have this opportunity to speak with Damon Gameau, who's a director, writer, producer, presenter, and an actor, and environmental rock star, Paul Hawken. Paul, I got a little side note for you. I came out to hear you speak at Temescal Canyon in, oh gosh, where is that? Santa Monica? Is it Palisades? Many years ago when you were talking about blessed unrest. And I remember you standing underneath the California oak and the audience just surrounding you in its shade to listen. And I was lucky enough to hear you in 2019 at the last in-person Bioneers Conference. Real thrilled to be with you face to face right here. Thank you. Welcome to both of you. And Damon. Damon Gameau is a multi-hyphenate Renaissance man. That Sugar film was Damon's first feature-length film as a director. It won Best Documentary at the Australian AACTA Awards and became the highest grossing Australian documentary of all time. This new film that we've just watched, I'm sure you agree with me, it's an innovative feature documentary exploring what the future would look like by the year 2040 if we embraced the best solutions already available to us to improve our planet. It was released in April 2019, and it's already in the top 5 highest grossing documentaries of all time in Australia at the cinema. Damon is a sought after speaker who's spoken at the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit in New York. He's also addressed numerous governments around the world, and he's spoken at such organizations as Google, BP, ANZ, Atlassian, Utah Clean Energy, MasterCard, and many more. He was a New South Wales nominee for Australian of the Year in 2020. An environmentalist, entrepreneur, author, and activist, Paul Hawken has dedicated his life to environmental sustainability and changing the relationship between business and the environment. One of the environmental movement's leading voices, Paul is the founder of Project Drawdown, a nonprofit dedicated to researching when and how global warming can be reversed. His book, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming, was written and edited in collaboration with the Project Drawdown research team. Welcome to you both. And let me start with Damon. Damon, your daughter's 7 now, right?
She is, yep.
And being a parent, how do you think younger generations will receive this film? What do you hope their takeaway from it is?
Well, I guess we've probably got some pretty good data now on how they have been receiving it. The film has been out for a couple of years in Australia and has now sort of made its way around the world through Europe, and it's about to launch on Earth Day in America. And that's probably been the most heartening aspect of this journey, has been the response from the children. We developed some pretty extensive curriculum materials to go with the film. And we've now had almost 2 million students have been taught those materials. And every week we get sent really interesting, innovative ideas from the kids about what they'd like to be when they grow up. Engineering models, doing seaweed hoodies and seaweed t-shirts, and building small microgrids themselves in their own Lego setup. So to me, it just speaks to the necessity of using solutions and hope as a motivation. These kids are a bit sick of hearing how bad things are and only being presented dystopian narratives, especially in our mainstream storytelling. That when we do unleash that creativity in them and show them and highlight the people that are doing extraordinary things around the world, we invite them to participate and kickstart a creative aspect to their thinking, which I think is essential in this moment. So that's why I keep doing what I'm doing. I love this because I think it's a way through. We've got to give these kids genuine muscular hope.
It's, you know, it's hard not to despair. And I just wonder how optimistic the children are that changes can happen before they inherit the planet.
Well, I think you saw that in some of the interviews we did with the children. It's very mixed depending on where they're at. And some of them I chose to leave out of the film. There were some very eloquent children that were talking about the despair and how upset they felt about what was going on. So it just depends how engaged some of the kids are. Where I find the most hope is probably that age bracket, 16 to 19, there are some of the most powerful leaders emerging from that generation, and that they understand this material far better than most adults. They're articulate, they're passionate, they're driven by the material. And I just think we need to get out of their way sometimes because they do know what the right thing to do is. And those of us with the knowledge, the best thing we can do is escort them and nurture them and encourage them to keep going, because it is a world they're going to inherit. But we've got to make sure we keep showing them the solutions that are available and scalable.
Did Velvet like the movie?
Velvet has not seen the film yet.
You gotta be kidding.
No, all her friends have seen it, but for some reason it just hasn't come up. To be honest, we don't really watch much TV, which is strange for a filmmaker. But yeah, the time will be right. Just not yet. She knows about it. She could probably tell you what it's all about. But no, we haven't sat down and done that just yet.
Paul, you've been writing about climate and the environment for a really long time now. What progress have you seen over the years, and are you optimistic?
Wow. It's sort of a Dickensian time, you know. I mean, it's the worst of times and best, and it depends which way you're looking, you know. You're optimistic, pessimistic. I mean, really both are true. The science is quite incredible, and I would say impeccable. And if you just pay attention to the science, it's a heavy load. It's a heavy burden to carry. And the optimism for me, we are researching a new book, as you know, Regeneration, but and optimism for me is about the speed and alacrity with which different elements of addressing the climate crisis are occurring. And I think they're occurring much, much faster than people understand. And usually the message is like, it's slower, we're behind and we're not doing as well, there's more emissions. You know, it's always kind of a story of failure in a sense, or semi-failure. we're not hearing the stories of success, and and especially on renewable energy. I mean, renewable energy, fossil fuels are dead. They're just dead, and so are internal combustion engines. And probably the most optimistic thing I can tell you is that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and McKinsey have not predicted the lowering of cost or the rate of increment in renewable energy for 20 straight years. They've got it wrong. They underestimated. And so there is this bias in these institutions, you know, that is a business as usual bias. In other words, well, we're all business usual, but here's, you know, and actually reality has always outstripped their predictions, which are based on models and all that sort of stuff. But reality is that we're way ahead of where they thought we would be with respect to storage, which is batteries, EVs, which with respect to cost of EVs and ubiquity that's coming. I mean, and then I would say the rate of growth in solar and wind, and the fact that solar and wind are now the cheapest form of energy in the world by a comfortable margin as well. I mean, there is even solar power now being put in at 0.5 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, you know, you pay what, 20, 25 cents a kilowatt hour? I mean, and so those are where I think you can be realistically and justifiably optimistic.
I'm going to keep my fingers crossed, and from your lips to God's ears. Let me put this question to both of you. Given the effects of climate change, like the snowstorms in Texas, extreme cold, extreme heat, and wildfires like ours in California, Damon's in Australia, that impact the power grid, could renewable energy microgrids prevent serious breakdowns of the system in the future? And what can be done to allow people to control their own energy needs, bottom up instead of top down? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go, Paul. You want to?
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Well, I can relate that to Australia because obviously we went through what we did with the bushfires, and there are numerous communities now that are rebuilding and not connecting to the main grid. They're actually setting up their own community batteries and microgrid systems. We had the first launch of a community battery only a couple of weeks ago in Australia, which is a large battery that sits in the middle of a range of homes, like 30 homes, and they all access that battery, and they can, like an Uber service, they can access the power when they need it, store it when they want to. It becomes a value add and an extra service. So those things are proliferating quite regularly around Australia at the moment. I would say that the best analogy to use here is that we've gone from this very centralized energy source, and that's what the model's been, very top down. But what people sometimes don't comprehend is how vastly different our new system is going to look. It's not a simple replacement. It's going to be much more decentralized and dispatchable. So in that sense, I mean that there won't be just a central generation of energy at all times. When the wind's blowing, it'll pick up the wind from there. It'll grab from a large solar farm somewhere. It'll grab from the rooftops and the batteries around the city. Even now in parts of Europe, they're using the parked battery of an electric vehicle to plug into the grid. So the grid can access that battery when it wants to. So it's a very new way of thinking. It's like having a stereo in your lounge room that blasts out through the whole house. The new model is small speakers in each room that you can turn on and adjust depending on which room you're in. So it's a very new way of thinking of it. And that is a more resilient system. So if we do have another fire or more climate shocks, which we know is going to happen, we're not relying on that centralized source. Suddenly, small communities can kickstart their own power, which gives them that sovereignty. And as I showed in the film in Bangladesh, it can also keep the money within that local economy. If we get to that point, which would just be terrific. But the incumbent utilities are not going to give up that power in a hurry. But that is what's possible in the decades ahead.
How about you, Paul?
I agree with everything that Damon said. And in the Kincaid fire in California, it was the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe located near Eureka who had a microgrid, and their gas station and their stores were running, and and everything else was black. And that was a microgrid. And that was a teaching to everybody in Northern California about whether to depend on PG&E or depend on your community. And as Damon said, the incumbent utilities, I mean, utilities started by Thomas Edison. in New York when he put up the first coal-fired power plant. And then he strung wires, to different users. And from that point on, the idea of the generator power and the owner of the grid were the same thing. And I mean, and they have fought tooth and nails, utilities, against what feed-in tariffs, which is basically you get paid for the energy you generate. In South Australia, and Damon can speak to this better than I and so forth, but in October, the whole state was run on solar energy. 75% of that energy came from rooftops on homes. And that's because Australia has a very, very good system of feed-in tariff, and also just sort of turn the key kind of system where you come in, they'll do it, they'll set it up, they'll lock it in. I mean, the homeowner doesn't have to be an expert at anything, and it's done, and they save money. And we can have that everywhere in the world if we want. And the complaint in Texas said, well, the wind turbines failed, and of course, which was what mostly failed was actually the gas-fired, generating plants. But even were that true, some of the wind turbines did freeze up. Why? Because every wind turbine north has heaters and keeps the lubrication warm. And so you can have 0 degrees, minus 10 degrees, those wind turbines will keep turning. Texas decided not to do that.
I know that there are home roof sized turbines now, or at least I've seen them.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have a microgrid based on those?
But not really.
No.
I mean, if you're out in a farm, you have a ranch, you could probably stick them up here and there and so forth, but a microgrid really is many sources of generation that are pooled, so that, with storage, so that you can, Damon's down the street and he's got energy I don't, or, whatever. And it was really detailed in 2040, but a microgrid can be plugged into the larger grid or not, that's up to those. But when the big grid goes down, the microgrid is still operable. Because the sources of energy are local, and people are moving more and more to storage. That's another good news story, which is the cost of storage is just plummeting, beyond what was predicted, and it's going to be, again, I think it's going to be ubiquitous in the world, having storage, so that intermittent sources of power, which is wind and sun, of course, can be coupled with storage. And you'll have baseload power for everyone in the world without having fossil fuels.
Damon, do you want to add anything, or shall we move to the next question?
No, that was good. I just say an interesting point with that South Australian government that Paul mentioned here in Australia. The story there is that's a conservative government too, and no one expected them to do that. But just because of the economics, that's what they did. And they're now going to be the first state in Australia to go 100% renewable energy. And that'll happen by 2030, which will be regular. So there is heart there that these are not just progressive governments doing now, that the economic stacks up for all of us to be doing it.
Well, Bill Gates has written a book about how to avoid a climate disaster. Paul, do you think that his involvement will make any kind of difference? Can it help encourage other big business leaders to take up the cause? And Damon, I'll ask you separately, are there any ideas in his book that you haven't already covered in this film, or that you might take issue with? This is presuming that either of you has either read the book or read about the book.
Well, I'm going to be very cheeky and say the way to avoid a climate disaster is not to read Bill Gates' book. I mean, and it is like the narrow, geeky, nerdy, technocratic idea of climate. And it wasn't lost on many people that a week after he did his big book tour, he invested $4 billion in a private jet company. All right. So what he's seeing and believes, and it's sincere, he's a good man, he's a nice guy, and all that sort of stuff, is that the problem is energy, because that's 74% of the emissions on the carbon side are from combustion of fossil fuels. Okay, got it. We all agree. But what he doesn't see is that is an outcome, but that is not the cause. That is not the cause. The cause is us. It's our the way we live, the way we organize, the way we design our houses, our cities, our jobs, our transport systems, our agriculture. I can go on and on. Those are the causes. and then we feed that inefficiency with fossil fuels. Okay, so changing out the energy mix doesn't change and solve the climate crisis at all, because the climate crisis is one of a living Earth. The Earth is in crisis in the sense that, you know, everything we do on an economic level is extractive, and so it's harmful to life. And so somehow I just feel like Bill Gates hasn't gone outside yet, you know? In other words, go outside, stay outside, go camp, go be out there in the Cascades for 2 weeks, you know, and come back and talk about fusion and nuclear power. And, you know, I just feel like it's a big, big disconnect from what's possible and what we need to do. And we've got to really step back and look at the causes, and the core causes are that everything we do economically degenerates life, which means it harms life. And so unless we stop degenerating, it doesn't matter if you have an electric car, it doesn't matter if you have a solar panel on your roof, you're still enacting economic and personal activity that's degenerative to life as a whole. And that's why the new book is called Regeneration. That's why Damon and I are working very closely on this, because that really is, you know, paradigmatically how we bring this all back together, you know. I mean, this idea that climate change is happening to us, it's happening for us. It's a beautiful teacher. And all you have to do is listen. And what it's saying is we have to have all our systems in alignment with life itself. And life itself has to be at the heart and core of every decision we make, social, municipal, whether it's economic or corporate, you know, the core of that decision has to be based, will this support life, increase life, or will it diminish it and harm it? And if it does the latter, it's not a good decision.
What do you think, Damon?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Paul and I have spoken about this. I think that, you know, respect for Bill Gates, but that mindset is not the answer. That if you think that technology and constant growth is going to get us out of this mess, it's just not the case. Our economy is going to double in size by 2043. It's going to be 7 times bigger by 2100. And yet we're already doubling the capacity of resource use on this planet. So it's madness to think that we can keep extracting and building more materials to stop this. We actually need to look at this far more holistically, and the best sort of carbon capture technologies I think we have is the biological ones. It's the soil, it's the seaweed and biomass. And that's why I put that in the film, is what a beautiful opportunity to not build more technology and sort of have this mechanistic reductionist mindset in what we're doing, but actually go back to the earth and consult the biology and all the life in that soil that comes back when you put the carbon in there. Then you hold the water, then you get healthier food, or you alkalize our oceans and create habitats for fish with the seaweed. That's the better world I want to live in. It's not just a continued expansion with a bunch of billionaires that are owning all these materials. That's not the world any of us, I think, really want. And so I respect him, but it's not a book that I'm necessarily wanting to read right now. And as Paul alluded to, I think we need authenticity in our leaders right now, more than ever. And here is a man who is expanding his private jet company. He still has shares in Exxon and Chevron. He's the biggest landowner in America. He's using countless chemicals on that land and growing GMO crops for feedlots. That is not how to avoid a climate disaster. So I don't think people should be pontificating unless they're going to come from an absolute place of authenticity in this moment.
Is there any chance you guys can educate him? I mean, he would have influence. He's a big voice. He's got big bucks.
Yeah, Paul can pick up the phone and text him. You want to do that, Paul?
Yeah. He always picks up my calls. So.
You know, I don't know if I have another minute to ask another question. Do I? Okay, cool.
I have a minute for an answer though, which is,
oh yes, please.
It's not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the middle out. And that's another misunderstanding. If we look for the top to think, know, understand what the top does when it does it well is incredible. And I think Biden is surrounding himself with really great people. But we should not look to the top. We should hope the top joins us. But it's not bottom up, it's not top down, it's middle out.
Sarah, you have about 6 minutes. You have about 6 minutes left. Then we'll take audience questions, and we can come back and take give one or two more questions to.
I think this next question will probably take up the rest of our time together. But I mean, except for the last questions at the end, I am 100% completely taken with the idea of marine permaculture, and this was the very first time I'd heard of it. For either or both of you, Is it taking off? Is it still experimental? How quickly can we get it up and running to help the seas? How quickly could it help the seas and life within thrive?
Well, there's a good story there I can lead off with, is that we set up an impact campaign off the back of the film, and it invited people to, if they resonated with something in the film, to get going and commit and join the movement. And we raised almost $1 million in a crowdfund campaign to build the first marine permaculture platform. So that's now underway in Tasmania, in a place called Storm Bay in Australia. And that was from $10, $15 donations. Lots of school children gave their lunch money to that project. And we planted the baby kelps about 8 months ago, and they've already grown 10 meters tall in that short amount of time. And we did a test site next to a fish pen there. And there's quite a bit of controversy around the fish pens here because they leach some of the nitrates into the water. And the seaweed absorbed those nitrates as it grew. And actually, the seaweeds by the pens grew much faster than our other control studies. So it's an incredibly positive story. There's about 10 applications now in Australia for commercial scale seaweed farms. There's a big one growing Asparagopsis taxiformis, which is the seaweed where if you add it to a cattle feed, it reduces their methane emissions by over 90%. So there's a huge farm of that happening in Australia. And in the US, I'd encourage you to look at a company called Running Tides. They've just started a large scale marine permaculture site. And it can be used now for a range of purposes, nutraceuticals, for biofuels. McDonald's have just ordered 1 billion seaweed straws. So once you put the hot water on it, it just dissolves. But really, we need to be also storing that seaweed. We can't just use all the seaweed we grow for food and other things. And we want to store it on the ocean floor. And Running Tides have already started doing this, that once you store below 1,000 meters, the weight of the ocean actually stores the seaweed on the ocean floor. So potentially we could lock away carbon for millennia. So I do think it's an incredibly exciting project. If we had a carbon market and a carbon price, which we hopefully will have in the next decade, then that would really accelerate the uptake of that particular technology. But it is happening. But again, as we've talked about, my worst case scenario would be a Google of seaweed in 20 years. I hope we have these sort of decentralized ownership models around the world, right up the coastlines of all these different countries, which provide a wonderful security, a food option if the land crops are affected due to drought. We've got this great resource of food from the ocean, and all these communities can access it. It's not owned by a really centralized top structure. So like you, that's one of my most excited solutions. I really think it's going to have a big impact on our future.
All right, Paul, weigh in, please.
I couldn't agree more. Dr. Brian Van Herzen is really the forerunner and the forefather of marine permaculture. We were having a conversation the other day, and Australia valued the Great Barrier Reef at, I think it was $67 billion is what it's worth. I mean, now how they calculated that, who knows? I mean, tourism and this and that, you know, and putting a monetary value on the greatest living structure on Earth is kind of a funny thing. But nevertheless, we were sort of canoodling, you know, about, let's see, what does this take? And we're looking at scratch pads and this. If there was $2 billion of marine permaculture platforms on the Great Barrier Reef, it would de-acidify it, bring the coral reef back, bring back the fish. And then I was doing, okay, how much alcohol is sold in the Gold Coast, you know, in Australia? Quite a bit. And if we did a 5% tax on all the alcoholic drinks that are there, it would pay for restoring the Great Barrier Reef. And so here you have, and who wouldn't want to restore it? If you're there, you're a tourist, you're a diver, you're a fisher person, you're whatever, you know, 5 cents more or 5% more on your martini or your beer, whatever it is. And so we have the ability to start having a circular economy, not only just the stuff in it, but that is our intentions and in this case, our capacity and ability to actually restore life on Earth.
Well, I'm going to hand it
jump
back
in. Can I just jump in? Because for locals, Bay Foundation in Santa Monica, they're doing kelp restoration right here in our Santa Monica Bay. So if you want any local connection, if you're here in Santa Monica, check out Bay Foundation. I'll include that in the links. So let's take a couple, is it quarter after? Yeah, let's take a couple questions from the audience and then we'll go back. Eddie Pachterman has asked, the solar sharing grid idea sounds awesome, but I'm sure there must be some drawbacks and or challenges. What are they? How can we overcome them and push for a collective grid?
Well, obviously the biggest hurdle in the US is that it's largely illegal right now, which is a pretty impressive hurdle. And it was in the UK until last year. That's been revoked in Australia as well. We've now really raced ahead with the technology. So in a lot of ways, we're being the guinea pigs for the rest of the world. And the main problems we're facing is that the existing architecture of the grid is just designed for one-way flow. And like I said before, it's a big centralized unit. So trying to find ways to share the energy back and forth and share it between different houses, that's been a bit of a hurdle, but there's lots of innovation, as often happens, coming through to try and solve this problem. So I would say that Australia is probably going to lead the way. And as I said before, the fact that these communities are already hooking up, a lot of our new communities being built now on the edges of the suburban of the edge of our cities are using these microgrid setups or the community batteries. So we really are getting a robust way to set them up, which we will then, I imagine, export that knowledge to the rest of the world when the time is right. So yeah, we're going to see it expand rapidly. As Paul said, the cost of the batteries is just plummeting. The cost of the panels is plummeting. Most people are seeing, even if it's not for the sake of climate or a moral choice, they're doing it because it's a smart and economic thing to do.
I have to ask this one because Sarah and I had a discussion, but Nathan says, my daughter Ember, who's 6 years old, wants to know if you're really sitting on top of the wind turbine.
Absolutely.
Is it really her wanting to know, or is it you?
Absolutely.
Nathan, it came from Nathan. Nathan, I can't pronounce his last name. I swear to God, it didn't come from me.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
you can answer that.
holding on, and we were so afraid we were going to be blown off, you know. I mean, and
It was in Texas, wasn't it, Paul? It was in Texas.
Yeah, it was in Texas. It was one of those ones that froze. Actually.
Yeah. No, that was our sensational VFX team. So that was Paul and I in a green screen studio in San Francisco, and then we went and shot a drone shot of those towers, and then built it all afterwards. And they even put the shadow on Paul's face. So they did a sensational job.
They did.
That's what tricked me, was the shadows on the face.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope I pronounce this correctly, but Cray Van Sickle has a question for Paul. He said, I gather you're working on a book on regeneration, which you've mentioned. There seems to be some debate over the percent contribution regeneration of soil and land sinks can have in reaching drawdown. Do you have any late-breaking information on this, or what is your thought on the emphasis this is getting? Also, any insight on how to create new markets for kelp and other sea crops?
Yeah, first of all, the reason I'm doing the book Regeneration is to try to rescue the word. People think it just refers to agriculture, or it's a kind of a weasel word now. People say, oh, it's regenerative. I'm trying to kind of bring it back to its core meaning, number one. Number two is, if regenerative agriculture didn't sequester any carbon at all, which it does, of course, like crazy, but so forth, we would want to do it, because what happens is it creates more life in the soil. And you get the most important thing happening with regenerative agriculture actually is water percolation and storage. And you're getting like 10, 20, 30, 50, even 60x more times of water percolating into the soil on regenerative farms versus the hard pan you get from industrial agriculture. And the earth has been dehydrated. And so in a sense, we're rehydrating the earth. We're bringing water back to the earth that has been lost because of agriculture. And so, of course, the way it does that is create life under the soil. And it does that through cover crops, perennial crops, you know, that the lack of herbicides or any disturbance or tillage of the soil and so forth. So in a sense, life is being built up in the soil, and the outcome of that is carbon. But the arguments about how much carbon, this much carbon, we have modeled it in the new book, and by zone, by soil type, by crop type, by and so forth. And we've come up with some numbers, which we'll share when the book comes out. But I kind of, what's the word, shrivel now that I see Bayer, Monsanto, Cargill talking about their carbon program of, you know, basically sequestering carbon in gold standard, and you can get offsets and so forth. And they're not moving away from industrial ag at all, you know, but actually trying to decrease carbon just by the use of cover crops. And so it's an amazing, amazing technology. It's an emerging technology. It's not going back to the past. Some of the breakthroughs that are coming from farmers are extraordinary. But the most important thing is that the difference between Monsanto and regenerative agriculture is that Monsanto puts chemicals to feed the plant. Okay, regenerative agriculture puts in nutrients to feed the soil. The soil feeds the plant. If the soil feeds the plant, it's a healthier plant. It doesn't succumb to insect infestation, but the plant is more nutritious and it feeds people. So you feed the soil to feed human beings. And if you feed the plant, you're putting agriculture in an IV drip system. And basically you take it away and the thing collapses and so forth. So I think we have to understand regenerative agriculture in a much broader way. But the thing about regeneration in the book is about regenerating neighborhoods and society and everything. You know, it's not just nature, it's actually us and how we treat each other, you know, what we've done with our stolen lands, you know, which have belonged to indigenous people and still do belong to them, you know, and how we treated, you know, obviously the previously enslaved people that we kidnapped from Africa and so forth. I mean, this is true here and it's true all over the world and so forth. That is part of regeneration as well. And we say and make it very clear that if we are not addressing poverty, if we are not addressing those who are suffering, if we're not addressing human rights, we're not serious about reversing climate change.
It's all about connection. Everyone's connected. Damon, how do you choose the projects to highlight in your film? There must be so many. What were some others that didn't make it into the film?
Yeah, the original cut of the film was 3.5 hours, and that's testament to how many great things are out there. And I would have happily played that film, but no one else seemed to enjoy it as much as I did. It really came down to, and this was actually from a conversation with Paul early on. I met Paul about a year into the process, and was actually trying to distill some of the ideas we'd found. And Paul said something to me at a cafe that was, the way they'd selected the solutions in Drawdown was that even if climate change wasn't happening, you would still want to do 99 out of the 100 of those solutions. And I thought, that's just what a wonderful framework to try and choose these models. And in fact, it worked out that way. A lot of people saw the film in Australia that were skeptical of climate change, or wives took along their husbands that were a bit dubious on it, because we still really have well, not 50%, but a debate going on in Australia, much like you do in America. So I really wanted to try and make the film appealing to those people, to say, let's do this anyway. Look at the benefits to soil and food. Look at the benefits of empowering girls and women. Let's do that anyway, but we get all these wonderful bonuses that relate to emissions and other factors. So it really came down to solutions that had a holistic remit. They had to have a cascading raft of benefits. As Paul said, it's not enough to be this narrow focus as we get back to Gates again. That doesn't matter if we just deal with our emissions and we've got big solar or big renewables and we've got massive amounts of income inequality and we're still destroying the planet. What's the point of that? We've got to actually do a complete system overhaul with this. And there are solutions out there that do cover a wide array of solutions. So that's how I chose those.
We have time for one more question, and either or both of you can answer this one. Fossil fuels are dead, as you said earlier, for energy, but the petrochemical industry is ramping up plastic production to compensate. How do we solve that? Not an easy one.
In the new book, there's a whole sector called industry, and there's the sick care industry. I don't call it really healthcare. There's the war industry. It's not the defense industry. There is the big food, all right. There's the clothing industry, which is fast fashion. There's banking and finance, which is basically put $2.7 trillion into fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement was signed. Okay, thank you very much. You know, and it says in the first line of that, you know, people put money in banks to save for the future, and banks take your money and destroy the future, and that's what's going on. But when it comes to plastics, that's in there too. And what we make very clear, and it's just so clear now with the science, is just stop already. Plastics is not useful. We don't need them. We have to get rid of them completely. We have to tax them so that no one ever throws it away. It's so expensive. And we know now that the microplastics and the chemicals that are in microplastics are everywhere. They're in dust clouds, they're in the little dust bunnies in your house, they're in your water, they're in your food, they're in your fish, they're in your vegetables, in your carrots, they're everywhere. And those contain chemicals like BPAs and others and so forth, which now are shown to cause fetal damage, and birth defects and cancer and so forth. That's plastic. So the idea that somehow, oh, well, we'll recycle, we need more bins, or, this sort of understandable, we all thought that would work. It didn't. But the fact is we have to get rid of plastic altogether. And we can, by the way. It wasn't that long ago we didn't have it. So, anyway, I agree with the questioner, which is, and I've read the same article about, okay, no more oil, so we'll just put it in, the $40 billion, $40 million Formosa plastic plant in Welcome, Louisiana, more plastic, and we have to stop that thing. That train has to stop.
Okay, I lied. I'm going to ask one more. This comes from Josephine Miller, and I apologize I didn't mention the last two people that asked questions. Allison Schill asked a question. And so Josephine wants to know what immediate number one action would all three of you, I guess she's including me, like our privileged Santa Monica community to take to reach this vision for 2040? What's the best thing we on the west side of Los Angeles can do?
Go ahead, Damon. You know Santa Monica really well.
Yeah. Well, I'd say, again, I think sometimes we fall into a trap of being prescriptive for everyone, and we say, go and, ride your bike to work or whatever it might be. And so we did develop this tool so that rather than me answering that question, go to our website, whatsyour2040.com, and there's a button there that says activate your plan. And we've designed this questionnaire based on what your interests are and how much time you have and how much you can commit to this. And then we'll offer up 6 or 7 things for you to do in your area, in your community, your school, the workplace, whatever it might be, things that resonate with you. And then there's a much bigger chance of you seeing them through and committing to them because they are aligned with your own passion. So I would encourage you to go and check that out and see what it is. But apart from that, I often say, I just don't think we're talking about it enough. I think have conversations, even the difficult conversations. We're just not sharing this as much as we should be. And we are social animals. And the more we can talk about it, we establish new norms and we send signals to each other about what's acceptable. So make it normal to talk about this. Make it normal and exciting to talk about regeneration and not dwelling on all the problems and what we need to fix. But let's get excited about the better world that we can create on the other side of this crisis.
Great. So I'll add what's your 2040 when I send out the email to everyone. And remember, I mentioned earlier, the city of Santa Monica has a new calculator so that you can see what your impact and what you can do in Santa Monica. So I'll include that. And I lied one more time. I have to ask this question from Sandra DeSimone. Will this film be available to schools? I would love for my little activists to be able to see this documentary. It's fantastic. Shows hope for the future.
Yep. So I think on the 22nd, on Earth Day, it's showing on the CW network. So it's very much aimed at that younger generation. And then if you go to our website, whatsyour2040.com, there's a schools button. And we have modified our action plan and the curriculum to the US. So you'll be able to download those materials and pass it on to the teacher and whatnot and get involved.
I have a 2-sentence description for Santa Monica. Defossil fuel your house. Get rid of your gas stove, your gas water heater, and your gas heater, and heat pumps. Use a heat pump, an induction stove, and you have no more fossil fuels going to your house, and you make sure you're getting renewable energy into the house. That's your feed. You'll actually save money, you save energy. It's a capital cost for sure. And once the car out there that you have, or whether if you have one, is an EV car, you will have reduced your emissions as a family by 42 to 45%.
Great. And I keep reminding people, but in Santa Monica, we are getting 100, unless you opt out, you're getting 100% of your electricity from renewable sources. And the city has I had it on the PowerPoint at the beginning, the city has a big plan to go all electric. They have rebates and everything. And I'll send that information to people as well. So I'm going to take it back to Sarah for, go ahead.
Gina, can I just add something really quickly? Because
Certainly.
we just did a report to do a presentation to some banks recently. And since the Paris Agreement was signed, the 35 of the world's top banks have invested 2.7 trillion into expanding coal, gas, and oil around the world. So the number one thing you can do as well is to move your money. JP Morgan and Bank of America are two of the worst offenders in the whole world. So if you are in some capacity banking with them, they are using your money to extract and cause more damage. So that's another thing you can do, is find a bank that isn't supporting fossil fuels.
Great suggestion. Thank you so much. Back to you, Sarah, for one or two, depending on how long the answers are. We can do 2 questions. Go for it.
To be honest with you, you know, you two have, Paul and Damon have already kind of addressed a couple of the questions that I wanted to end up with, but you met in the course of making this film, is that correct? You two?
Yes, yeah, it was a Telluride in the US at a film festival. Yep.
Yeah.
And from this film came the notion of of this new book, or Paul, had you already been working on regeneration?
We both had in parallel. Damon had been using the word regeneration on his site, the regeneration, you know, and I've been thinking about it since 2012. I gave a talk at Pioneers on regeneration, been thinking about it for a long, long time. Because I feel like, you know, when I grew up outside, you know, and I just felt like there was a disconnect between the technical approach, you know, to climate, you know, which is understandable, and we need good technology, we need solar, so there's nothing wrong with it. But the way it communicated to people was that, you know, the problem was over there and the fix was over there and there's nothing I can do. And I wanted to actually, you know, change that. And then when we met, I mean, we can finish each other's sentences. It's kind of weird. And because we are so aligned in terms of where we think, I mean, he does a much better job than I, but I mean, where we think the communication has failed and where we think the communication can actually enliven and enlarge and engender and bring people together and create those kind of conversations that Damon's talking about, and people working together, you know, and actually getting excited about it, as opposed to, you know, I better do this or else, you know, which is kind of, you know, that sad sack way of approaching climate, which is, if I don't do this, you know, we're all gonna be screwed, or if I do this, it won't really count. I mean, there's both sides of that, and neither are relevant or helpful. And so we're pretty excited about regeneration as a way to get involvement, you know, and connection and action, because those are the things we need: action and connection. We all hunger for more connection now than we did a year ago for obvious reasons, but we always hunger for connection. That's what human beings do. That's why Homo sapiens beat the Neanderthals, because we were connected and we acted like communities and they didn't. And so the smaller little Homo sapiens, you know, prevailed. And so we are we're the creatures. We did it, we made it, it's our problem. But undoing it, so to speak, and regeneration, so forth, to me is like a gift, you know, it's like a total gift rather than, like I said, a burden, you know. And it's the most amazing time ever to be alive, and the most perilous. They both occur at the same time. And so, yeah, Damon to me is, I mean, he's younger, but I look up to him as my mentor.
That's a lovely sentiment, and probably a very nice place to end. What do you think, Gina? Oh, you're on mute, girl. Open up.
I just want to make 2 quick announcements. Sustainable Works is having a big fundraiser next Thursday, March 11th. Fun evening, honey, a great organic food, music, really festive. Support our organization. We really need it, especially in these times. And in addition, remember, if you fill out the survey, which Brenda's putting in a link in the chat right now, I will also email it to you. If you fill out the survey to let us know what you thought about this event, you'll be entered in the prize drawings. So we really want you to do that. And I just want to say a huge, huge, huge thank you to our guests, Damon, Paul, and Sarah. You guys were amazing. Great event. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. A great film, so inspiring, which we need right now. I appreciate all of you. And thank you from Sustainable Works and from the city of Santa Monica.
Thank you, Gina. And thank you, Sarah. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. And thank you, Brenda.
Thanks, everyone.
And see her, but I know.
Oh yeah,
So
Brenda,
honored.
thanks.
So honored. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you, audience, for hanging out and watching and listening.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.